Great. Congrats to both teams to making it to partial quarterfinals of Drexel APDA. The motion reads, this House believes that animal rights groups should primarily adopt a utilitarian conception of animal welfare over a rationalist conception of utilitarian of animal welfare. Without further ado, we welcome the Prime Minister.
Cool. Oops. First on framing, what are these animal rights groups and how does their advocacy work? These can be large foundations like the WWF or smaller grassroots charities, can look like vegan activists, individuals on social media, etc. But generally, their most common goals involve a few things. First, animal protection, things like sanctuaries, anti-poaching, which are often funded by like donations, etc. But second, things like reduced meat consumption, so encouraging individuals to go green once a week and those kinds of things. But third, there are also things like sustainable farming, like trying to reduce factory farming, trying to get like organic grazing and things that are just better for these animals. I want to note there's a spectrum here. Obviously, in neither side of the world are these animal rights groups trying to stop people from eating animals altogether. Like we know, and the vast majority of these people are not stupid and know that that's not something they're going to get everybody to do. But there are margins that they're trying to encourage individuals to do. So eat less meat, buy less factory farmed food, spend a bit of money on these sanctuaries, and those are still massive margins that can make a big difference between whether millions of animals are harmed or not. The ways in which these are enforced are a few fold. There's donations, there's boycotts, there's lobbying government, but critically, all of these ways need critical mass, which is to say it can't just be the most dedicated animal activists that engage in these actions. Because the animal industry and meat industries are so widespread, these are ones that you need a lot of individuals to be willing to do, and not something you can just have the most dedicated people on their side to do, which is why this is important. We're going to prove why critical mass is something we get on our side. What does it mean to adopt a conception of animal welfare? In terms of the utilitarian conception, it is likely to look like showing graphic imagery of animals in suffering, or animals like in pain, screaming, etc. But notably, this is more likely to be homogenous, that it applies to all of these animals because there are ways in which those things can happen. The second, in comparison to rationalism, they're likely to, I want to note that rationalism is likely to have to involve things like trying to show how animals possess high cognitive properties, things like interesting survival instincts, maybe like spiders spin very intricate webs that are good for catching like insects, or complex processes for thinking, etc. Ones that are likely to show how these animals possess human-like cognition. This is a pretty charitable definition, I think, to their side. But critically, I want to note it's more likely to have to differentiate between different animals and suggest which cognitive abilities we believe are more worth, or which animals we believe possess higher cognitive abilities that therefore grant them that worth. Lastly, I want to note the adoption of this framework translates into everything. This is not some principle-only debate where it's about whether or not only we think this is true. These things matter when it comes to social media messaging, the policies you push for, what images you share. These all affect practical things of the way the movements act. First argument on the principle of utilitarian arguments being the correct moral stance. Why do you think animal rights group does to some extent care about the correct moral stance for animals? Two things. One, they're passionate about these animals. They likely feel very bad about this pain. And note, you have to be very emotional about this to be willing to go to the extent of spending so much time and money being part of an activist group like this. But second, the correct moral stance here is partially a prerequisite that decides what priorities might be more important and what goals you should put above others. The mechanisms then here for why utilitarian arguments are true and pain is a few fold. One, we don't know what sentience is and the ability to have an inner experience is. Rationalist viewpoints depend on consciousness extending to non-humans, but our lack of understanding of consciousness means that it doesn't make sense to differentiate between animals as well. I can see when an animal suffer, see them writhe and pain, but we can assume that they feel it, but we're not able to actually confirm the consciousness or understanding of how they rationalize that. Two, pain and pleasure is the simplest and most evolutionary earliest trait. We have similar receptors. Pain and pleasure is important to survival, so all organisms evolve with them quite well. This is something we understand far better than consciousness. When we feel pain, our rationality gets overridden. Our pain is similar to the pain of these animals, and they deserve equal moral worth. But three, the possibility that animals can feel pain and pleasure immensely is enough. Opt runs the massive risk of misidentifying the complexity of some animals over others, or misidentifying the complexity of some traits over others, and ends up not protesting or preventing harm to a group that shouldn't experience it. And on our side, we have the guarantee that everyone does feel this pain. On their side, they've got to roll the dice. Second argument then on accessibility of messaging and buy-in. Three mechanisms here. First, it's difficult to explain or differentiate between animals' cognitive properties on their side of the house. You need experts to be able to explain why these cognitive properties are shown through the actions that they do. You need time and social capital. This takes much longer to show people how these animals are organizing in certain troops or moving and traveling in certain areas, like due to high cognitive processes, rather than just showing that the animal is in pain by screaming. And lastly, like a lot of people who aren't actively part of this animal rights group aren't reading this. They don't have the time to be spending a lot of like interest trying to understand what these cognitive properties are or which animals possess them versus not. Because a lot of people just tap out or feel as if alienated, as if they don't understand what is going on, that it's too high level or too complex. Secondly, though, look, we say that pain and utilitarian like messaging is more visceral and emotionally powerful messaging on our side of the house. Humans naturally are inclined to feel empathy for seeing anyone in suffering or seeing others in pain. This is a more unifying movement that everyone understands the feeling of pain. Everyone understands how terrible that can be. People don't understand how terrible it can be to restrict individuals that might be high like cognitive functioning. Like people are not like as inclined to believe that someone who is necessarily smart or has interesting cognitive abilities is therefore objectively worth so much of your time and suffering. The prevention of that pain is something that more individuals are likely to believe is worth it enough, as opposed to like the benefits you can get from keeping those animals. But third, the message is just simpler on our side. People know factory farms are suffering. It's harder to show visually on their side what cognitive like abilities look like or what it looks like to protect those and why that's important. And this is critical, right? Because, and this is like the important neck as to why it's different. Animals are likely to display these complex processes in much more different ways that are harder for people to recognize. On our side, screaming is screaming. Those are things that, regardless of who you are, regardless of these animals, is something that you can see. Or and I think on our side, like the visual nature of this is likely to be far better. So I think that proves why, in terms of accessibility, messaging, and buy-in, more individuals are likely to empathize or sympathize with the animal movement on our side of the house as opposed to theirs, partially due to complexity, partially due to the nature in which they resonate with the kinds of messaging and images that are shown. And I want to note this is critical because this is what is going to ensure you get solvency to any of your goals in the first place. Even if they might try and explain to you that actually the cognitive thing is the objectively true like principle, it doesn't matter if they don't get anything done. I think some animals feeling less pain is better than none on their side. Third argument on factoring of the movement. We say three things here. One, different sects are likely to argue about which animals possess higher cognitive abilities and which ones deserve more moral worth over others. But second, you also have to decide between which of these cognitive abilities are more valuable in the first place. Also ones that people within your movement are unlikely to agree on. Lastly, there's also likely to be backlash from people in the animal movement who just believe that all animals deserve equal worth and who don't believe that the cognitive like messaging is something that actually enables this, or they believe that this kind of messaging is something that's going to harm the movement. This is a not negligible number of people. A lot of these individuals believe that these animals all deserve to be treated equally and are likely to be concerned that this messaging is going to like counteract that. So I think this is likely to lead to a lot of individuals within the movement disagreeing. This, at best, on their side, it's inefficiency. There's less time spent on things that actually matter and advocacy that matters. At worst, it means that the power of these movements goes down when you split them up and split up constituencies. Fourth, and criticism of the movement is just harder to disprove pain on our side of the house. On theirs, you have much less legitimacy. Most of these movements don't have infinite access to expert doctors or veterinarians or neurosurgeons who can verify the claims that they have these high cognitive abilities. On our side, it's much easier to show that these animals are feeling pain. It's harder for critics to show that that's not the case. For these reasons, propose.
Great, we think that speaker. We invite the yellow.
Okay, can everyone hear and see me? I know like when I turned my camera on this tournament, like my audio has been cutting out. Is this a problem? Can everyone hear me clearly?
Yeah.
Okay, sick. Cool. I'll do pleasantries. Leandro, great summer. Like we did a lot of prep. Hopefully it'll work out, you know. I liked all the practice rounds and the drills we did. Shout out to Muzzy for being a goated coach and helping us this summer, helping us get better. Shout out to some of the people on the panel who have helped me get better. Shout out to Abby, who's spectating, and any other GU novices who are spectating, because I think I see Blake in the Zoom. Hopefully we can make you guys proud. Okay. It'll be like off case, on case. Is anyone not ready? Cool. I think we can concede a lot of the PMC framing that tells you that broader mass appeal is really what matters and you need a critical mass to accomplish any of your goals. Why do we win on this clash? What is the moral explanation that we're going to likely advocate for? I think we're going to say that if we believe in human rights, then we have to believe in animal rights by a significantly similar degree, because animals are complex beings just as humans are. So when humans see these animals engaging in like complex structures, like they see a gorilla hanging out with their daughter, or they see a bunch of animals hunting together, or they see like a family building a family of birds building a house for themselves, then you see empathy. Notice, you don't have to say that animals are humans, just as they're complex enough to have fundamental rights or to do policy changes. Why are we unlikely to do the like characterization that PMC tries to go for, like scaling that certain animals matter more because they're like have higher cognitive condition? First, because marginal cases. I think the problem of marginal cases is something that the PMC doesn't even analyze at all. I think this is the most significant philosophical reason why we're unlikely to do this. Because if we said that certain animals should have more moral worth because like they're more powerful, then what about humans who lack these higher cognitive capabilities? I think that animal rights groups know that this is like unintuitive and like hard for people to explain, so they're unlikely to scale. But also because of the focus on moral personhood, i.e., the goal isn't to create a cognitive leaderboard. It's to explain why there's a threshold why people should be morally considered. And we don't need to say like, is a pig smarter than a dog, but just that both are almost as smart as humans, or as smart as humans, and therefore should be considered. Second piece of framing is how do most people consume their media about animals? I think it's likely through documentaries that show like nature, etc. Why is this? 3 reasons. First, because curiosity and wonder about the natural world. Secondly, because aspirational, i.e., these animals are living free in a way that like people want to do, so it's showing the animals in their full glory, so we admire them. And thirdly, because there's lower psychological barriers. Because when you watch a documentary about an animal, you start to identify. We start caring for every animal. That's why you watch a documentary about gazelles, you feel really bad when they are eventually eaten by an animal. This means that when humans see that animals are similar to themselves in being complex beings, they're more likely to have sympathy for like animal rights advocacy. A few reasons. I'll explain. But let's talk about how we're going to explain utilitarianism on Gov's side of the house. I think people don't understand Phil, and they don't understand like the rational calculations that go into utilitarianism and evaluating pain versus pleasure. Which means that they're going to ask the question, why does the pain of animals matter more than my benefit of like cheap groceries or eating meat or engaging in factory farming or something? Then you necessarily have to showcase the pain, which is explicitly what the PMC says. They're going to show pigs dying in a machine, chickens screaming of pain, the ads of PETA that is done for the last 50 years that has been a disaster. This is literally what PMC explicitly advocates for. This means that they have to demonstrate the pain through gruesome images, and rationalist arguments don't have to. Why does this turn a lot of people off? I think this happens or like why does this like actually turn a lot of people off? First, because of psychological defense mechanisms, i.e., I think cognitive dissonance of people who eat meat experience a conflict when they say like they think of themselves as a good person, but they see that they're funding cruelty. They see the pigs screaming, they see this is all my fault, and so they start to get alienated from it. So they're just going to dismiss, avoid, or attack the source of the disturbing information. Or secondly, is like people are just going to become numb or desensitized, i.e., one death is a tragedy, but 1 million deaths is a statistic. So when we show that on the ground level there's a gorilla that's building a house and hanging out with her daughter, then you see that you have empathy for that gorilla because it's just like me. It's what I could be in the future. But when you see 1 million pigs dying, you just become numb to it. You think that it's part of how the world functions. Thirdly is the pity paradox, i.e., constant exposure to animals that's helpless or suffering reinforces the power dynamic where you basically think that the way that the world works, it's humans torturing animals, and it's always going to be that way. So you just resign yourself. So you end up alienating way more people than their side of the house because you're focusing on the act, not the actor. This means that people are just going to like either A, think you're guilt tripping, get alienated, or they're going to attack you for like going after their viewership of them as a good person. I.e., I don't want to hear the argument because I'm so disgusted by the image. I disassociate because I've committed this action and caused this pain. I associate this and crucially, you start to associate this horrible feeling with the movement. Why does that not happen on the comparative on ops advocacy? First, because you can show this cognitive complexity without pain, i.e., the gorilla is doing this complex operation, or these lions are hunting together and being a family, they're building a house. The preconditions of all the Gov case are to show all of these harms and explicitly alienate people. But even if that were not to be the case, why are rights more intuitive than utilitarianism? First, because rights are intuitive and absolute, i.e., we as humans are raised with concepts like the right to life, freedom, and the right to be free. this doesn't require like a complex cost benefit analysis. So when we see a gazelle or a bird in a nature documentary being free, and then that same forest gets deforested or something like that, we start to feel horrible for them because we see that they've lost the right to be free. We don't feel horrible for them because we think, oh, they probably felt a lot of pain when like that forest was being harmed. The second argument is on religious people. I think religious people are a critical are a critical advocacy group for animal rights. Why is that? First, because a lot of religions already have advocacy against like eating meat and participating in the meat industry because they advocate against like eating pork in Islam or eating beef in Hinduism. But we think that religious people generally, when they make decisions based on preconceived moral notions, i.e., when religious Republicans make decisions, they say things like homelessness is wrong, so like we should arrest all the homeless people. Immigrants are wrong, so we should arrest immigrants. Not thinking about the utilitarian calculus that is associated with this. But intuitions of like rationalism are used in religion, i.e., Genesis says that you have to protect the animals in Genesis because they're God's creation. And when we see how complex and amazing God's creation is, and how like they're accessing their rights, of how they're engaging with grief just like us, of how they're doing problem solving, we start to think of them as just like us and they're just like God's creation. Why does this not happen with utilitarianism? Because you don't consider with utilitarianism pain, because pain, A, is either not God's creation, or pain is the outcome of God's will, i.e., you think that it doesn't need to be changed because that's how God ordained it, or that pain is not God's creation, so it's not associated with religion. This looks like on their side of the house just reinforcing their biases, because people are unlikely to interact with the religion, or unlikely to interact with utilitarianism because it's just more unintuitive to them. This means that this means that there's going to be advocating against factory farming, i.e., a utilitarian pitch to a religious person probably looks like the suffering in factory farms is so immense, it outweighs the pleasure we get from meat. But this is just going to be met with God gave us dominion over animals for our use. How can we measure their suffering against our need? But the rationalist pitch probably looks like science shows that pigs are intelligent, and we can see that pigs are intelligent. As stewards of God's creation, we have a duty to respect these complex beings and protect them from the profound cruelty that happens through factory farming. This means that you can frame the issue much more easily in the moral and theological framework that these people already have, and you can reinforce their actual biases. The weighing here is like, even if some people go and are super radical because the pig died, the people who vote don't support PETA policies, which means actual policies don't get done like the PMC tries to advocate for. With regards to religious people, even if you have some people, religious people control lots of welfare and can control the narrative very effectively. So by accessing these two groups better, by appealing to their moral intuitions, it's much easier to get the critical mass that Alex talks about in the PMC. Okay, let's go to some parts of the PMC. They say that there's going to be like you're going to like scale animals and say that like a certain animal matters more than another. But I think this is unlikely the case because animal rights groups already have intuitions that humans and animals are very equal. So you're not going to want to like try to like separate the two. There's no warrant for this. Then they say that there's like cognitive memories, and it's very hard to explain that. I think you can just show them being smart, and I think the messaging is likely to be very effective considering it makes a lot of profit, and you can show it through like channels of entertainment. Very clear op ballot.
We thank that speaker and we invite the MG.
Hi everybody, I'm Clement. I guess we should do a content warning for like graphic imagery, but it's just like normal stuff I feel like you'd expect us to discuss in this round. We're gonna mainly go off case and then on case later on, doing some weighing. All right. The first thing they tell you is that the messaging that people are going to give on their side of the house is simply that if you believe in human rights, you ought to believe in animal rights too. If you see like a gorilla taking care of the daughter, there's several problems with this. First, different animals have different degrees of complexity, and it's very intuitive for individuals to go like, maybe I care about gorillas because we're genetically very close to gorillas, and the gorillas sort of look like us in that they have 2 legs and 2 arms, but I don't care about pigs or fish or any other organism because they look so different to us and they don't display the qualities of taking care of a daughter. But secondly, the general public's intuitions about animals is very difficult to overcome, right? I.e., we see pigs as being very, very stupid animals, even though they're in fact and scientifically very, very intelligent animals, which is why there's a huge barrier that they need to overcome in terms of messaging in order to get protections of the animals that they ought to care about on their side of the house. But furthermore, it's very difficult for this to extend this to all animals, insofar as soon as you're talking about the language that cognitive abilities matters, that it is the fact that gorillas need to be people who care about their daughter. One allows other people to say, maybe you don't need to care about gorillas because here's XYZ videos of gorillas eating their young or beating their children, and therefore they're not deserving of respect because they're savages. Or secondly, you also have other animals that are not going to be protected, and you actively harm the message, even though members of your own group want to protect lesser cognitive ability animals on their side of the house. Secondly, they say is that you won't differentiate the scale between animals, and this is saying in response to this rebuttal, because it suggests that humans who don't have these cognitive abilities don't deserve worth either. This isn't how the vast majority of people think, right? The reason why humans think that cognitive ability matters is because we think cognitive ability in a very general sense, right? We think in terms of like human species as a whole, or the capability to believe this, or at a certain basic level that we see another human being that looks like us and we assume that they have the ability to think and have an inner monologue. The problem on their side of the house is because animals are fundamentally looking so different to us. They behave and breathe so differently than us that you're unable to close the empathetic gap that is easier to close with other humans, which is why this logic doesn't apply. The third thing they say is that like even if they agree that like animals feel pain or pleasures, humans just don't care for non-human animals because they're like, why should I prioritize the pain of a chicken over my pleasure? The problem with this is several-fold. Firstly, the empathetic distance that we need to close is a lot easier since mass majority of people already agree that chickens can feel pain. These aren't rational beliefs that people hold. It's still based on emotions, which is why when we tell people that in factory farms, chickens are going crazy and biting themselves off, you will hear those emotions and hear those stories and actively feel bad about these images because we're taught from a young age to be able to empathize with relationships that can be told to ourselves. But secondly, most humans don't disagree that animals feel pain or pleasure. For instance, we know intuitively that we shouldn't go around kicking puppies or kicking like rabbits for fun, even though if you believe that like you eat meat, it doesn't mean that you necessarily believe that you can do whatever you want with animals. So the only thing that we need to do in our side of the house is show that the same care that you show to dogs, for instance, or cows or other animals or other human beings are the same care that you should show to cows or turtles or whatnot, because those animals feel the same pain as the other animals that we currently protect. But thirdly, even if we're unable to get full animal rights, so people who don't want to eat as much burgers or they're unable to commit to not being vegan, the problem is we can also have harm reduction efforts be a lot easier on our side of the house simply by the fact that people feel slightly bad and concede certain concessions. For instance, they push for policies that make more humane killings of lobsters and crabs, for instance, or they do things like oppose factory farming, or they're willing to spend slightly more money on free-range chickens. These cause massive benefits to the animal community and are things that people care about, which is something you're able to do when you prioritize the message around harm rather than a message around cognitive abilities, which encourages the individuals not to care about these movements, but also to have a far higher bar of entry to believing in the movement's messages in the first place. The third thing they say is that, it's very, very difficult to showcase the pain, and even if you don't successfully showcase the pain, the rationalist arguments don't have to show this gruesomeness, so we're easier by comparison. Several things to this. One, rational arguments don't need to show gruesomeness, but they need to show something far harder, right? Which is the fact that people have cognitive abilities. Like, how do I show grief in like clownfish or pigs or chickens or cows when their grief is fundamentally different from the ways in which humans express grief? So you're probably talking about more video seconds, longer pages, while descriptions of violence and gruesomeness not only have many different forms. I can show people videos, art, like the pictures, where I can just describe to them with the English language the imagery of watching a as cows being ripped apart from their children, or the fact that like cows are cut into pieces and baby chickens are grinded the moment they are born. These are very simple ways in which to describe massive amounts of pain, and the reason why people don't become numb or desensitized to it is because we do this in a smart way, right? We don't blast them with thoughts and statistics about how millions and millions of animals are dying. You do this through the correct ways of showing a wide range of different images that show different forms of suffering at different times, and the simple fact of how gruesome they are, the reason why it's so difficult to forget, because we never see these types of images in real life. And it isn't true that the issue with your argument at the endpoint is wrong, right? If you end up feeling guilt or shame, maybe some people try to ignore it, but it's difficult to ignore things, right? Cognitive dissonance exists, but cognitive dissonance doesn't work to 100%, and they can be actively broken. So when you're given more options to eating vegan food, more financial market decisions, more times interacting with this animal movement, the time you spend second thinking yourself is the time and places in which we are able to convince people to change. So in all those many cases, that is when guilty people on our side of the house who see images and feel bad doesn't have to eat meat on a particular day, or they can give you $20 to your organization or a dog shelter. So even if we bite the bullet on guilt, we think it actively works on our side because we can overcome this cognitive dissonance. Secondly, they say people are going to be alienated from you because they feel like we're guilt-tripping people who are meat eaters. This is a problem, right? Because their alienation is worse. Because the idea that maybe we should kill animals in less painful ways is something that people probably already believe in. Therefore, they're not so offended when you tell it to them, right? Versus when you make people feel like they're eating animals that have families, eating animals that have children, that grieve in the same way as us. It's a lot more disgusting for those individuals if you tell them these things, and it's much harder for them to believe, which is why the cognitive dissonance is much harder to break on their side of the house, and you get worse reactions on their side. The third thing they say is that like rights are absolute, right? But rights also have a higher burden of proof. It's easier to prove that like a harm is done to an animal than to prove that an animal actually cares about being free. But furthermore, humans have priorities about rights. Every human believes in the fundamental right that people should not be killed, or that people should not be harmed, as a very intuitive, high impact harm. But the right of a gazelle to like gallop in a like wherever they gallop is a lot harder to believe in and care about. But the third thing they say is that religious people are a critical advocacy group for animal rights, and you're told to protect animals because they are God's creation, and you paint them in a human light, right? Several problems with this. One, religious people already believe that animals are God's creation. Whether or not they are similar to humans in behavior doesn't matter to them. In fact, they actively believe in human supremacy because we're the only ones that are created in God's image. So it's even harder to convince religious people that animals are similar to humans and possess human traits. But secondly, we can still make them see that God's creations are beautiful. Where in the same way religious people make arguments about environmentalism, we can make arguments that you shouldn't destroy nature in the sense that we shouldn't harm the cute little fluffy animals that God did to us. So on our side house, we still have the ability to appeal to those religious people, but we do it to a far better extent, and that's a flip of their argument. The last thing they say is the reason for why what I want to do is two things. First, I want to exploit away the impact of the fatuation that occurs on their side of the house that they don't respond to from Ali's side, right? Because the issue is that groups will necessarily disagree because group status influences how like new members are going to buy this idea. And some people believe that cows have low cognitive ability, while other people are unconvinced by the same body of evidence. This means two things. One, either your group message is very difficult because you can't coordinate and combine resources on scale, or secondly, people are not able to be receptive towards your message because when you tell people one image of a cow showing grief, some people believe it, but other people don't, while everybody can see the same image on pain on our side of the house. For this reason, our side is easier to translate to action, and we can get more people to care about animals for these reasons opposed.
We take that speaker and we invite the MO.
Hi, I have always jabbed off how much I love animal rights motions. So I am extremely happy for at last debate this shit. It'll be just like responding to MG and probably then like go more through in PM. But I'm gonna signpost, it'll be very clear. Content warner for like graphic imagery. We've all been discussing about this. Cool. 3, 2, 1. When most of the population see a pig being torn apart in a PETA ad, they have three possible responses. One, they find it disgusting. That is the most intuitive thing that they do. So they close the video. They don't even hear the first words about how you can donate in the first place. They don't have a link to do anything. They cannot just magically save animals because they don't have a mechanism. They don't know how to do it. You just close the video. Second, they feel, those animals are not like me. So I don't care that the chicken is being killed. So I will just go on with my day. Or third, you associate that bad feeling, that disgust, to the brand specifically, as PETA has done for 50 years, which is why everyone hates them, which means that you just won't advocate for them. Know this just preconditions the entirety of Goff case. What MD tells you is like, it's not easy to ignore, but this is not responsive to LOC warrants. But guys, like, people ignore Gaza and the genocide that is happening and still vote for politicians that fund it. The reasoning for this is because people can't disassociate. When they know that they're doing horrible moral things, they decide to ignore them because the moral guilt is higher than anything they can do. Notice, they cannot respond in PMR. These are all Sahel mechanisms. Then they say like, but you show it in a very small way. No, it's horrible by all GovBench examples on how you do this. Then the delta is quite simple. This debate is not about getting more people. It's about not turning off people out of the movement. The reasoning here is very simple. It's very hard to get people involved in politics and to actually make significantly degree of changes. But you know what they can do when they see a policy that is environmentally friendly? They can either feel like, I don't care about that, or like, I never got enough information because I always close the ad, versus I will probably vote for this. I'll care. I'll showcase in polls that this is something that matters. This is the real delta in the round, just always flows up because they never explain why the rational decision of human beings when they see pain is trying to solve it rather than just being turned off. No responses allowed in PMR. But let's actually analyze their arguments, because I also believe that they are like very uncharitable. They say that it's very hard to show that animals are smart. Guys, when I see cows like looking at the floor with grief when they killed their mom, when I see that like birds create their own houses, when I see that pigeons actually know where their home is, I'm like, it is a very fun fact that I love. They just naturally can locate it in a map that they have internally in their brain, and I explain that to people, and I show it in presentations in high schools. I show them how animals are valuable. There happens two things specifically. The first one is that it does not matter that their level of smartness is different than me. I value the pigeon getting their home because I say, oh, that's so cute. I generate empathy because I understand some level of rationality, some level of we are at least somewhat similar, even if your way of showing like intelligence is significantly different than me. But second, the only response they get from NGO of this is saying, but you're gonna show gorillas killing their children. Who the fuck does this? Farms would lose all of their support if they did, because now they're advocating against like actual basic animal rights, which means that no one presents these horrible gorillas. I think that the most likely thing is just showcasing all of these good things. Then they just win against Goff, because then we have a very clear way to generate empathy. And I'm gonna do terminal Wayne here. Why is empathy more likely to cause change than pain? 3 reasons specifically. First, because when I feel empathetic, I feel like I can actually produce something. I'm in a moral neutral stance and I'm doing a good thing. And people feel good when they do things. That's why they donate. That's why they join NGOs. But when I am a moral responsible, when I've committed harm every time I've eaten a chicken, then I intend to ignore it because that would generate harm. Second, notice how empathy triggers my emotional part of my brain, i.e., hey, guys, I feel some level of connection to this bird called Maria, which means that I know we'll do things for that bird. That imagery can constantly be repeated on my mind. But when I see a pig being torn apart, I don't want to see that image in my mind, because that's very fucked up, which means that my brain tends to ignore it and does not do things for it. But on a third level, because now I can actually make community, because it's very easy to talk about Maria the cool pigeon with my friends, but then it's horrible to talk about how birds are like systemically affected by the farming system that does not generate support. Not a fun conversation topic, which means that people do not create communities that generate change. But this just proof in the materiality is that empathy is systemically better. And the worst part is that they cannot respond to any empathy mechanisms because all of this is subtle. I'm just implicating it in different ways. Let's go with the idea of MG that you need smaller policies. Guys, this is symmetric. You in op say that you need to do smaller steps, so you also do smaller policies. Then they talk about religious people. I think that this mechanism sounds very persuasive, but it's low-key very bad. That is saying, oh, humans are superior by God. First, very Christian-centered guy, check your biases. But second, I think that this just means that if humans are superiors, I remind you of the moral responsibility to protect them by highlighting the empathy that you have to feel for them. Notice how that empathy is just stronger by all of the mechanisms I've told you. Yet we both teams agree that the principle of PMC just kinda is outside of the debate. It is very intuitive that advocacy matters more for like the actual animals you're trying to help, and not like the moral value in abstract that humans have, and not that fucking animals we're trying to help. And this is like not an actor motion, so I don't care about the actual analysis of PMC. This is about what is morally correct. Morally correct is to support those animals. We're clearly winning on that. Let's go with this idea that you cannot confirm consciousness, because this is very basic. Notice how it's very easy to just prove that these animals don't like have huge consciousness, but what they do is have some level of rationality. They know what they are and they try to do stuff, which means that they are still have some level of big empathy. They say that you need experts to prove this. We already beat that. They say that every person understands how pain is, but it's very hard to understand cognitive consciousness. No, it's very easy to understand that when you have a family and where you're trying to protect them, that when you grieve the loss of your loved ones, that is some level of rationality and empathy that matters. Read the info slide, that's literally that. Then they say that the movement is gonna fight within to see which animals aspire. I think that this is beaten by Sahel, but even if it's not, I think that you still fight in government to see which policies to prioritize. In gov, you still need to like either advocate for farm change or environmental change. You do everything at the same time, but then you don't do shit. You need to be united. Because these fights already happens in anyways. That even if this happens, people just tend to match a consensus because they wanna actually do changes in the world and do not feel like their work is meaningless, which means that you always get this. The last idea I get from PMC that this is very hard to falsify pain. This is very unintuitive. I think that like you in both sides it's very hard to prove that cows have no moral value and like no one cares about them. So how do you evaluate this route? Because it's an outline, it's very important, so I want to be very, very explicit. The first thing you vote on is in LOC framing. We explain to you why people will always be turned off, which means it does not matter what PMC tells you, it's not well proven. MG just not respond to this. They say that it's just easy to ignore, that cognitive dissonance does not exist. But let's get techie, that is not responsive to Sahel, which means that PMR cannot pull through any of this. The way in here is just on precondition. The way this is portrayed on media immediately affects how people perceive it. Because when I hear a moral standpoint, I hear it from the perspective of a book, of a movie, of a YouTube ad that influences the way I understand it. So it does not matter that in abstract, humans may find utilitarianism more persuasive for the specific way this is presented, which always flows up. But on a second layer, even if you do not believe that this just turn a lot of people off, I think there's just like significant like warrants on why rationalism just loses in the comparative. Because notice, even if you see a pig dying all of the time, you eventually get tired of caring, because that means that you're always constantly committing crimes. Notice how people know that the pig suffers anyways. They've seen it before. They understand this because it's been the strategy of PETA, which they concede in LOC and of major organizations for 50 years. And guess what? Not a lot of things have happened. When you change to empathy, when you change to caring, you make people care, religious or not, in their moral intuitions. They're more likely to be engaged. By any of those reasons, you just cleanly know that Sahil and Leandro go to science.
Your sound is off? Okay. It'll be framing, ballots, whatever, it's an all. Okay, cool. First, just a piece of LOC framing that literally frames PMR out of the round. I say at the top of LOC that because most people consume media about animals through documentaries about nature because they're curious about animals, because they want to admire them, they want to see them being free. most of the understanding of animals comes through that. Why does that matter? They never prove how this visceral pain, even if it was effective, would exist in those nature documentaries, or why we would actually care about it. Because the only reason why we care about each animal's pain in those nature documentaries is because we've grown an attachment to them. We've seen them be just like us. We've seen the gazelle care for her children. We've seen the gazelle be in a family. And then when she gets hunted down by an animal, we feel really bad because we've grown an attachment to them. Know that this is unique compared to their analysis of pain, because we don't care about each individual's animal's pain at the same extent. I care about my dog's pain more than I care about your random animal's pain, because I've seen my dog act in ways that are similar to me. I've seen my dog experience grief, but I don't understand why I would care about an animal's pain if I don't understand the cognitive processes that they use to process that pain. Secondly, what is critical is there's no mechanization of how visceral pain, as a result of like human animals, that animal rights groups would want to present would actually happen in these nature documentaries. So if it is the case that most people consume media about animals willingly through these documentaries, they're literally framed out of the round, and the best case for them is like somehow it happens in these documentaries, which they never sexualize. But why do we win in their best case, which is essentially just that they show visceral pain, and visceral pain is a better motivator? I think Leandro does a lot of weighing on why empathy acts as a more effective motivator and it's less likely to turn people off. But why specifically would humans respond to this better? Because it appeals to a higher moral principle that we grew up living with, i.e., pain is supposed to focus on like compassion or pity, which is the idea that like this pig is suffering, so you should feel bad for it and stop the suffering. But people are going to think that this is condescending. They're going to think that like it's not actually responsive to the person. They're going to attack it. It's why PETA has been so unsuccessful at doing the stuff that PMC advocates for. Meanwhile, on our side, you see empathy for a moral actor. It focuses on universal moral principles like justice and respect. Let this being be free. It has an inner life. It has interests and a capacity for joy in relationships just like you. So to harm it is a violation of its inherent right to live its life. This is a much more stable and respectful foundation for people to engage with. But when I see a gruesome piece of material, I just disengage entirely. I want to reject it because I want to preserve my mental health. It's why we stop caring about even human tragedies when they happen over time. It's why 1 million deaths is a statistic, but one death is a tragedy, because we care about the individual deaths more because they have a story behind them. But then, how does seeing an animal like solve a problem actually access this level of empathy? Because it makes them seem less like these simple like automatons or like conscious beings, and it shows that they have an inner life just like humans. It shatters the illusion of them being just like the other. So we start to project our emotions and experiences that we can understand from our own experience. We can no longer dismiss their pain as just a simple reflex, because obviously when I see that gruesome video of like a pig getting like destroyed in factory farming, I understand that it's a subject. I understand that pain is happening, but I don't understand why it subjectively matters and why I would experience a similar form of pain, because I can't understand why I would ever be in like that type of situation. But I can understand why I would experience grief. I can understand why, like, when I watch a nature documentary of like a gazelle losing its child, how I would experience that grief and how we have to do something to stop it, i.e. stop deforestation, stop factory farming to ensure that more animals don't lose their lives. The best gut response to this is that basically you're only going to care about certain animals because they're seen as less cognitive. But the problem is this is beaten in LOC, where I tell you that there's no incentive for animal rights to do this, because they want to present animals as though they have a moral personhood, which means that similarity destroys the hierarchy. The evidence of complex cognitive cognition shows us why we have logical and moral grounds to care about the pain. So if you want to evaluate this round on pain, you still vote up.
We thank that speaker, and we invite the PM to close the debate.
Okay, can I be heard and seen?
Yep.
Okay. It's just gonna be 3 ballots. first ballot is about your capacity to engage in advocacy. Our messaging requires less time, resources, and expertise, giving us a higher ability to engage in any action whatsoever. First, they miss the mechanism on unification. Their argument is that individuals are likely to care because these animals seem like humans, but they miss the analysis in PMC, which says that different individuals value different cognitive abilities more than others. Maybe a gorilla taking care of their kid seems valuable to someone, maybe a mother, but it's not necessarily going to be as valuable to someone who doesn't have that same feeling, who hasn't resonated with that idea. I think those are things that a lot of individuals are not likely to be unified on. Versus, everyone values non-pain. Everyone knows what it's like to feel in pain. And those are things that make everybody care. Versus on their side, whatever cognitive ability you choose to display is something that some people care about much more than others. Second, on visibility and understanding, on our side, everyone can see animals screaming. Or if you can't scream, you can see an animal writhing in pain. But on their side, unless all their fucking videos are going to be about gorillas, there's just some animals where you can't show the same cognitive abilities because they act in very different ways to humans. This is the analysis at the start of MG that goes completely dropped out of MO. They just say you can, but no, presumably the way that a cow shows grief isn't going to be seen the way that a human shows grief. And many of these individuals aren't shaped like humans. They don't walk or talk or move like humans, which means that the kind of things that they do to take care of their kids are ones that you don't see or don't understand to be those things. In the best case on their side, they have to actually explain what that means. That's more time, more time, more resources, more money you have to spend on that versus ours. There's two impacts of this. First, you fracture resources. The less time you have to spend on this kind of advocacy, the less messaging you get out there in the first place. That means less awareness, that means less ability. Sure.
The implication that because you have to explain, which is also new, there is going to be a fracture of resources is not, this is like fully new. Like it is not responsive. This is a construction on how when you have to do ops policy, then you spend more time and money, which is fully a new argument.
Wait, this is argument 2 of PMC.
Well, no, what you say in PMC is that it requires resources to explain that, but there's never any analysis of like the trade-off and whatever other stuff.
I think we understand what's being called new. We'll take it under consideration.
Okay, sure. Okay, but secondly, even if not, you have fracturing of people of the movement, which is definitely in PMC, in case you're wondering, which is to say individuals who are likely to be upset that some animals have to be prioritized on their side because they're the only ones that can visibly or understandably show those like human emotions or human actions and those kinds of things, which means that many other animals, which certain groups may care about, certain individuals who might care more about like ocean life than like land life are ones that like are going to be upset. So if anything, we access the impact on fracturing through this as well. This is critical because as Clement explained to you, the impacts of this are horrifying. It means that you lose the ability to get economies of scale from combined donations. You have less resources that you can share with each other. You have like often infighting, which means that like conversations become less effective and you lose negotiating power for lobbying. All of those are impacts that outside of documentaries you can and need to do. Things like social media, things like going to governments, things like boycotting corporations, all of which are things we frame at the start. Second ballot is on criticism of the movement. Two things. One, we explain it's much easier to disprove welfare based on rights and human-like stature on their side than to disprove pain, which is to say, yes, it is potentially true that you can show these animals being human-like, but there are a lot of critics who can also show these animals not being human-like, who can try and paint them as being seen as savages, that they that I don't know, black widows like kill their husbands or something like that. There are a lot of ways to show that these animals are like savage or not human, that they don't have the empathy that human has, and those are things that critics are going to like bump up on. This means that your messaging becomes a lot less effective because it's so much easier to criticize it. And I want to note the impact of this is important, which is to say, if you want to this animal rights like advocacy doesn't exist in a vacuum. It obviously has to balance against people who are fighting against you or trying to move against you, which is to say, the more open your messaging is for criticism, the harder it is to convince individuals that you're objectively right. It's much harder to prove to individuals why the pain of an animal doesn't matter, why when I'm watching like an elephant's head get cut off, why that's something that you don't believe is evil. I think those are things that a lot of individuals are less likely to be able to criticize as opposed to theirs, where it's much easier to nitpick or disprove the idea of being like humans. Okay, third ballot then on interaction with the movement. I'm going to split this into two kinds of people because I think there are two groups of individuals that we're talking about in this debate, and so it seems quite parallel. There are those who are likely to be easily desensitized, and there are those who are actually likely to act on the guilt.
Order. Everything about the framing on how people are desensitized of no is new. If the response is that MG mentioned it, I already explained in my speech how this is just assertive, and therefore any new mechanism is going to be necessarily be new.
Wait, I literally haven't even gotten to the argument yet. Let me structure the speech. Trust me, I'm saying things that we've said before.
Okay, I think we understand what's being called new and we'll take it under consideration unless any of the other judges have a question. Okay, great. I have you at 4:13 elapsed.
Okay, like the debate is a parallel, right? They say most people desensitize. We say a lot of people don't be desensitized. So we're going to weigh these two now. Let's talk about people who are desensitized. They say people feel empathy and this encourages action versus if you feel responsible for committing. But they miss the response from Clement, which is to say, on their side, maybe you care about that chicken that has a daughter, but you're still eating the chicken on their side. So if it's true that individuals are going to engage in cognitive dissonance or feel bad that they're eating this meat and therefore like just ignore the movement altogether, then do it on their side too. Because guess what? You're still eating fucking meat. Then they also miss the PMC line that explains why it's harder to feel empathy for a lot of these animals based on cognitive actions because of how different they are from you. So it's less likely that individuals actually feel that empathy on their side as well. Then let's talk about the people who act on this guilt. We explain to you why we make the urgency to make people change. They say your brain will ignore this picture. We explain why it's unlikely to be true. It's hard to ignore that feeling of guilt. It's not something that you just disappear. And for at least a certain number of people, that is the thing that is likely to catalyze action. Because on their side, if you feel good about these things or feel good about it, there's no reason for you to want to change your actions. You just like watching bears on TV. On our side, it's our side that creates the incentive to stop like eating as much meat, to stop buying from factory farms, etc. For all of these reasons, propose.